The 2008 presidential campaign, from the earliest days right through the primaries, through the conventions, and up to and through Election Day, was probably the most interesting and exciting overall of my professional career. I think most of my colleagues would agree that it belongs in at least the top 3 of modern American political campaigns, with all of its surprises, its subplots, and historical firsts. And now, as an encore, we are seeing an historic new era unfold in Washington. You know, presidencies fall roughly into 2 categories. There's the transformative presidencies, such as Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, transforming presidencies. And then there are the preserving presidencies, in which basically the president consolidates whatever gains there have been up to that time and more or less preserves the office. And many of our 20th century presidents have fit into that category. The early days, the first 100 days of President Obama's administration, is about as much more than a change in which party or which person controls the White House. Although those kinds of changes are plenty interesting in their own right. What has made and what continues to make the start of the Obama era so fascinating, whether you like him or not, whether you voted for him or not, is the circumstances in which he has taken over the job. Now, I use the words like interesting and fascinating and say it's interesting and fascinating because of the circumstances under which he came into the job, but I say these with an awareness that it's hard to view what's going on in the news right now with anything like detachment. It's clear that the United States, and indeed the world, are in the midst of a crisis, and I use that word measuredly, that threatens people's life's work, their savings, their very ability to provide for themselves and their families. That hard fact isn't so much interesting or fascinating as it is frightening. The question, though, is how we're going to get out of it, and what, if anything, the government can do to turn this recession around, or at the least keep our financial system from a state of outright collapse and depression. And once we start thinking about government solutions, and we are thinking about those now, we are by definition talking about politics. And that's where the interest and fascination come in, though tempered by the very real sense of just how high the stakes are for all of us. You're probably aware that people first started using the term the first 100 days to describe the flurry of legislative activity at the beginning of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency. From that time on, it has been used to describe the beginning of a president's first term, a gauge of performance that has less to do with any exact measure of time than it does with the recognition that for many presidencies, the first 3 months or so in office do set the tone for the years to come and provide the best window for getting a legislative agenda passed by Congress while the promises of the campaign are still fresh in the minds of voters, while a president's electoral mandate has not been diminished by new developments, and while a new Congress, a new majority Congress, can still be made aware of having gained its election on a president's electoral coattails, as has been the case with what we now have in Washington. Conversely, if a president tries to introduce big projects far past the 100-day window, he starts to introduce these big projects, he runs into a time when the most prominent thing on Congress's mind is the next election, with all the members of the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate up for election every 2 years. That would be 2010 in this present case. The first 100 days also coincides with the so-called press honeymoon, during which coverage tends to be more favorable on the hard news side and more weighted on the softer side towards human interest stories about the new first family and how they're adjusting to life in the White House. This applies to Republican and Democrat presidencies alike. These realities and the new approaches in governing that one is bound to see even when the presidency does not change parties are what make this period a particular time to watch. It bears mentioning, though, that this is not a one-size-fits-all model. One need only go back to the last occupant of the White House to find a presidency that had its moment of greatest activity and influence not in the first 100 days after inauguration, but rather in the wake of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. This probably owes a great deal to the circumstances that brought George W. Bush to the presidency, with the Bush versus Gore Supreme Court decision stopping the recount in Florida and therefore effectively granting him the presidency. In fact, you may recall that many said at the time that 9/11 was what finally put to rest questions of, quote, legitimacy surrounding the Bush first term, and gave him a mandate, no doubt about it, that he lacked upon entering the White House, lacked it in many ways. So the second Bush presidency, that is the presidency of President George W. Bush, does not fit the first 100 days most important mode. So each and every presidency comes with its own unique set of conditions and possibilities. Generalizations and comparisons can only go so far before one has to make all sorts of qualifying statements.